Good evening, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I am Sim Kapoor, and I have the honor of being OISE's Director of Advancement and External Relations. I will begin by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's expert panelists, and we will begin with my right. Professor Jeffrey Anslus is Professor of Indigenous Mental Health and Education. Dr. Anslus is an Indigenous scholar, writer, and policy advisor specializing in the areas of Indigenous education, mental health, and social policy. Through a number of research initiatives and partnerships, Dr. Anslus is making an impact in Indigenous mental health and the social and political landscapes for Indigenous youth. His bio is up there. There are many accolades and accomplishments there as well. So thank you, Professor Anslus. Principal Richard Messina is the principal of Dr. Eric Jackman Institute of Child Study. Affectionately known as Richard by the children of Jackman Institute, Principal Messina is helping to improve teaching and learning for the benefit of our public school teachers and students. He has served the OISE and Jackman ICS community as an educator, researcher, and dedicated leader. He's currently complementing his work with doctoral studies at OISE. Welcome, Richard. Thank you. Amy Shah is co-founder and CEO of PikaPack, which is an award-winning social emotional learning platform that engages elementary students to learn skills like self-regulation, empathy, and teamwork, and has a reach of over 200,000 educators and students. Amy holds an MBA from INSTAD and is passionate about improving youth education. Welcome, Amy. Dr. Michael Salvatore is a career educator, author, and renowned linguist. Dr. Salvatore is the Chief Executive Officer and Registrar of the Ontario College of Teachers. Dr. Salvatore holds a PhD from OISE and has served as a teacher, vice principal, assistant professor, and director of the college's membership services department during his impressive 30-year education career. Welcome, Professor Salvatore. Dr. Ramit Bilan is a chief learning architect and an award-winning internationally recognized entrepreneur, speaker, author, and humanitarian. Her mission is to raise potential by designing experiences that build resilience and psychological capital. Dr. Bilan was named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by the Women's Executive Network. Her latest book, Who Do I Want to Become, is for anyone who has been stumped by the question of what they're going to be when they grow up. Welcome, Ramit. A huge round of applause for our panelists. There are many voices and perspectives that are missing from the conversation, and today's panel's hope is to just start the bigger conversation that we should all be having. It is now my honor to introduce one of Canada's most important and inspiring educational leaders. He is known for his world-class scholarship in higher education policy, governance, and administration. Sure, I could mention his many distinctions and awards, including an honorary doctorate, and that he has co-authored over 10 books and 100 articles, but time doesn't permit me to list all his accolades and accomplishments. However, from my vantage point, he captures the essence of great leadership, thinking beyond the horizon, the ability to bring people together for moral purpose and common cause, and the humility to keep on learning while leading. Friends and colleagues, I would like to invite Dean Jones, Professor Dean Jones of OISE.
Good afternoon, everyone. I obviously owe Sim a large amount of money for that introduction. The check is in the mail. I want to simply say how outstanding I think this event is and how extremely happy I am that it's taking place here. This is a wonderful new facility. We've only started to get used to it. Of course, the school has been using it for all kinds of things. But in terms of the broader OISE community, I think it's just a wonderful facility, and I'm so proud that we're using it for this particular event. I'd like to welcome all of you. We have something like 400 individuals that are here or online that are seeing this in a streamed capacity. And I really want to thank all of the people who are here, everything from educators, researchers, faculty, student teachers, staff, alumni, and all those people who have joined us both. Thank you for coming today, and those of you who are online. I also want to welcome and thank our panelists. You've heard wonderful things about them. Thank you for initiating a conversation to discuss the future of Indigenous education, social and emotional learning, mental health, and artificial intelligence. Just a few topics, I think, to get us started about a conversation about the future of education. This event is about supporting better futures, not only for individuals, but for a collective benefit for society more generally, as we develop new and better ways to ensure that education is about ensuring a more just, healthy, respectful, and prosperous future for the many and not just for the few. So without further ado, let me call upon our panel leaders, our facilitators, Ramit and Michael, to moderate today's panel discussion.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Welcome to everyone. It's my pleasure to start off our panel, The Future of Education, which is clearly a very broad topic, which has elicited a lot of interest that we're glad to see. And as Glenn mentioned, we're hoping that this sparks conversations and dialogue beyond today, certainly afterwards in the time that we have to spend together. But beyond today, I think there are lots of other experts. We're going to hear from some of them today, but others as well. So we're hoping that we can continue this discussion about our future, and that is very bright, and talking a little bit about the promise of the future in education, not just here in Ontario, but throughout the world. As I think about what excites me about the future, and that's a tip to our panelists, that's our first question, is what's brought you here. I think about the future, and I think back to, as a young person, Saturday morning cartoons and watching the Jetsons, and I don't know how many of you recall that was a futuristic show in the 70s and maybe the 60s. And I remember watching it and thinking it's never going to be possible that we'll have moving sidewalks and phones where you can actually see the person that you're speaking to, and a robot that does housework. And then as I was getting ready for this panel, I was traveling and I was FaceTiming with my niece while I was at the airport on a moving sidewalk, and in the background was my Roomba that was vacuuming the house. And I thought, oh my gosh, I am George Jetson. The future's already here. And I think that's one of the interesting things, is that everything's possible, and maybe what we explore tonight is what's desirable among the possible things in education. What excites me is that possibility that the future holds. So maybe, Jeffrey, we'll start with you. What excites you about the future in education, and as a springboard into our discussions?
I'm still stuck on George Jetson. That's funny. I think actually what excites me the most about the future of education are young people, and I guess that's kind of a cliche answer for educators, but I think about the types of youth that I encounter in schools today. Our schools are changing. They're incredibly diverse, but they're also full of young people who are very engaged in their community, socially and politically, asking for better societies and better ways of being with one another, and connecting across often vast geographical spaces to issues that they see themselves in. And I think that excites me, to see young people engaging in that way. Yeah.
Absolutely. Richard, what about you? What excites you in the...
You know, I have to say that our teachers excite me. Our teachers, in the sense that we're finding teachers who are not waiting for PD to happen, but are designers of their own professional development. They're moving away from maybe Pinterest and moving more towards TED Talks, really trying to understand more and seeking out research. And I'm excited for teachers because their role has changed. Dewey predicted this, or said it should have happened over 100 years ago, but now society, technology has finally caught up. And so we are now defining what that role is, what needs to change and what needs to remain more as strong as possible in place.
An exciting role to shape what our future might be. Amy, how about you, the excitement of the future of education?
I'll build off of that, actually. I think the capacity of teachers is going to change so much. It becomes less about, remembering all the facts, and more about, a lot of critical thinking skills and a lot of social emotional learning skills where you need to prepare students for the next 20 years or 30 years where jobs will be different. And I don't think that's scary. I think that's exciting. I think it's great that we're going to have really resilient, empowered future generation who are going to take on tomorrow's challenges. And so I think that's really exciting to see, how do we kind of shift over time to be able to have that capacity to give those skills or provide those or educate on those skills to help be adaptable and prepared for the future.
Terrific. And Ramit, just because you're moderating doesn't mean that you don't have to answer. So how about you? What excited you about coming here tonight and talking about the future in education?
Thank you so much. And I'm actually going to build off Amy's comment. It is exciting. The landscape of jobs is changing so quickly. So there's a study that came out last year in November by Dell Technologies. And what it said is that by the year 2030, 85% of jobs that will exist have not yet been invented. And so when we think about that, the year 2030 is actually about 11 years away. So that's coming up very quickly. So this idea of the changing landscape of jobs as well as challenges is very, very real. And you might say to me, I'll be retired by then, but from this point until 11 years from now, there's going to be so much change. And instead of being afraid of that change, it's this opportunity to actually get excited about it. And I think for decades we've focused so much on hard skills and technical skills, and that's been the focus. But yet with this future that's so unknown, I see that there is this shift that's actually focused more on character education, and it's so, so critical. And what we used to call the soft skills, we are actually now referring to as the essential skills for 21st century leadership. And that to me is so exciting. And I'm actually going to propose the next question, and I'm going to throw it over to Richard, because we are talking about this idea of change. It's inevitable. It's happening at a fast pace. When I was younger, I couldn't say when I grow up I want to be a web designer because there really was no web, or a social media strategist, or anything like that, because these things didn't exist. But how do we create meaning out of the change for teachers and students, especially something that's beyond kind of the flavor of the month approach? So how is this change going to be meaningful for both teachers as well as students?
Well, I think what we have to examine is the pedagogy that informs our practice when we talk about change. So if we look at the relationship between the teacher and the student, that's pivotal in the classroom. And so if the teacher sees herself or himself as the gatekeeper of knowledge, then that means that there's going to be transmission, and the role of the child then or student is to receive that information. But we know now that in terms of meaningful change, pedagogy has to be where the teacher sees herself, again, or himself, as somebody who's modeling learning for the students, somebody who is inviting the student to develop skills that we think of, the skills, or perhaps it's the attitudes that we want children to have when they are adults. And so we've done this exercise many times with adults, asking them to write words, and often things like dealing with complexity, learning how to learn, being an innovator, very different than learning how to learn. That means creating new ideas, sharing new ideas, and improving situations. The idea that we work collaboratively. And again, what does that mean? And then the fact that our decisions have ramifications on our world and on others as well. So if those are what we're striving for, meaningful change, or our pedagogy will be working towards that. Are we making learning environments that are facilitating that are improving that, or are we undermining those aptitudes? And so I think that's very important. Again, that changes then the role of the teacher. And I mentioned Dewey earlier on. Dewey talked about how school wasn't the preparation for life, but is life, and that the transmission of information isn't going to serve students. And this was before technology. We know now that children have access to as much information as we do. I mean, I'm watching the music awards with my daughters, and I can appear as cool as them, or maybe that's a bit much, but I can at least inform myself as to whom this singer is that I've never heard of by simply Googling that. So what is the change that we need teachers to be addressing? It's we want them to be teaching how to synthesize, how to be critical receivers of that information, how to contribute in ways that can be heard, how to listen well. And so that's what I meant earlier about how the role is going to change in terms of no longer being a gatekeeper, but then there are all the other social, emotional values and learnings and development that the teacher absolutely is critical for. So I think that I hope answers the question.
Definitely, and what I'm hearing also, it's not a matter of now speaking at students, and it should have never been a matter of that, but it's more so about speaking with students and including them into that process, right? And having their voice heard and looking at what the needs are because they're changing so quickly. Anyone in here Google things? Yes? Okay, so our Gen Z, the ones that are in high school and higher ed right now, will think we're super old because they don't Google anything. They YouTube it. Right? And so when we think about that simple generational change, I Google things literally I Googled things coming into this, right? But to the next generation, that's outdated, right? Emails are outdated. And so when we think about even how we communicate with students, that needs to change too. So if we create meaningful change, and as an educator, I remember the first time I taught, my students came in higher ed, I was teaching and they were on their phones and I got a little upset about it, I made a comment. And then my students came up to me at the end and they showed me their phones and they said, "Miss, I was taking notes." Right? And so this idea of flexibility, I think, is so critical, especially to make meaningful change, both for educators as well as students. If I want to engage my students, I need to bring technology into the classroom. And so I think that's just this ever-evolving piece. And speaking of technology, that actually brings me to my next question, which is related to artificial intelligence. And so there's this idea out there that the robots are coming, and some suggest that they're already here. And so when we think about artificial intelligence, especially from the context of education, what does that mean for us? And so, Michael, you're not off the hook since you're moderating, so my question is going to go to you. And can you speak a little bit about ethics as it relates to artificial intelligence in the scope of education?
Thanks, Ramit. I wasn't expecting that one, but that's the flexibility and the adaptability I think that's coming into to play. One thing I would say is I work at the Ontario College of Teachers, and one of the roles that we play is in helping to establish with all of our partners, with members, with parents, with stakeholders, what are the standards of practice for the profession, what are the ethical standards, how do we articulate what it means to be a teacher in Ontario, what the public can expect of teachers. And my colleague Kathy Anstedt is here tonight and will be happy to chat with you later and show you some of the materials that we have. And I think when we talk about change and we talk about anticipating the future, the standards, I think, offer us something that's stable. I think there are enduring values that are part of our society, of our Canadian society. I think our ethical standards of care, respect, trust, and integrity are values that endure and that we can infuse into our work. I will come to the AI question that I'm hopefully artfully avoiding at this part. But I think often, and was part of a talk a few years ago that talked about, is ethics the hidden curriculum? Is it just not obvious and explicit that we're teaching ethics because it's infused into everything that we're teaching? Or is it neglected and that we're not talking explicitly enough about care and respect and how those are how they're manifested? And we look at that in teacher education, but I think we can also look at that in the work that we do with students. And I think the important part of all of this is it underpins other systems. So at the college, they're not just an articulation of what we believe about teaching. We use them to design teacher education. And I think it's important for students that we use them to design curriculum. So we're developing the curriculum with these enduring values in mind, with their pathways or school community partnerships that are predicated on trust and mutual respect. I am coming back to the
AI?
Yeah, the AI part. I thought about it on a really simplistic level as I was coming here and thinking about inquiry and the reliance that we have on Siri and Alexa and Google and asking a question and based on algorithms getting a response. And that's really not, I think, what we want students to do, to simply stop after they get their response and move on. We want them to challenge that response, to look at it critically, to ask for other, so maybe you ask Alexa, Siri, and Google the same question and then triangulate that. But I think think, again, going back to the skills we want students to have of critical thinking, I think they need to apply those in all the realms where we see artificial intelligence slowly creeping in some ways in good ways, some ways maybe not so advantageous. How was that?
I think that, yes.
Enough for now?
That's okay. And let's build on that. And I'd like to integrate the conversation, or I'd like to integrate mental health in this conversation of artificial intelligence, building off even technology. And when we talk about things like social media, we at OISE, we curated a webinar on the dark side of social media, right? And although we have these platforms that encourage us to share our voices, there's also a dark side to it. And there's a side to it that really impacts our mental health. So Jeffrey, I'm going to throw the question over to you. If you could speak a little bit about artificial intelligence in education and how it connects to mental health, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so I think it's just, I guess the first thing I would say is these relationships between new technologies and emerging technologies and AI and mental health and education are just fraught with tension. And I think that's like a really important place to start the conversation, because I think, some on the side of this conversation just hail new technology as like, this is it. We're going to figure out how to address issues of mental health. We're going to figure out how to reduce risks in communities. And there are some valid reasons to be excited about the potential of technology to do that. For example, we know that something as simple as seeding a little bit of public health information into social media environments can have tremendous impact on people's readiness to access certain types of services. We can predict with pretty good accuracy whether or not a person is extremely depressed based on the types of things they write or post or images or videos they post within social media content. But the flip side of that is also going back to this issue of ethics around what are the implications of that type of technology in terms of surveillance? Who are the people that are policed by that type of process and technology? And it's often the case that it's people that are already marginalized in systems of education and healthcare that become over-surveilled by those very same processes. So I guess my thoughts on its future is that I think what it will require for all of us is a greater degree of critical literacy in technology, that we as educators, as people working in leadership, in roles in education and healthcare and social service, need to become much wider in our readership around technology, and to, I think, not take a phobic response towards technologies like AI, but also not to rush in and sort of over-adopt without critical consideration of the implications that it may have. I also think one other thing I'll plug in is I think with AI, we need to be thinking about the types of relationships we have with AI often resemble the relationships we have with one another. And in places like Canada, we're not doing great at relating to one another. We're fragmenting in our relationships in society, and that will begin to mirror itself within AI as well. So if we think that we're struggling with issues like reconciliation in education with one another, technology is not just going to magically address that for us. It's actually probably going to mirror many of the same issues we have with one another.
Thinking about the future, Amy, this next question is for you, and anticipation and sometimes prediction, or the capacity to which we can do that. And then thinking about the challenges that young people face in their lives, are there ways that we can predict, that we can be proactive in anticipating what kinds of challenges they might experience and how that might impact their learning currently and into their future? And can you talk a little bit about some of your experiences in that realm and helping anticipate and then proactively work toward a goal with students?
Definitely. So we work with a number, as an entrepreneur, I work with a number of education leaders to proactively, develop solutions. And so one of the things that we've been curious about, if you think about social emotional learning, you're, enabling not only the educator but the child and maybe a parent also in terms of having these conversations about teaching and learning these skills. But one of the big things in, you talk about mental health is understanding a topic around self-regulation. And so how do you become more aware of your own emotions? How do you then actively manage those? And for folks who have experienced any kind of adverse childhood experiences or, bullying or any kind of, thing that kind of indicate any future mental health, it becomes even more a focus to learn these self-regulation skills. And with that, one of the things that we've been kind of working at, if you go into a lot of early childhood classrooms or special ed classrooms, often you're doing check-ins. So you're doing a check-in with the child to say, how are you feeling today? And, even just that quick check-in of saying happy, sad, anxious, as you get kind of older, more complex, is really helpful in terms of setting, how am I feeling today, and then actively then managing it. So one of the things that we've been thinking about, how do we use technology to say, okay, how do we allow children to self-check-in? And then be able to share that data with a teacher or a counselor to actively be able to be proactive. So say Emma Smith is checking in increasingly more and more down moods. How do we then, instead of letting that wait till a behavioral incident or something that comes up in the classroom, to be able to provide coaching one-on-one, have a conversation with a parent. So how do we use the technology to be, a tool to give a view into the child's perspective and have conversations, allow them to speak up when they need that support. So, raise their hand within that process. And I think that's where we're interested in, how do we shape tools that really help be able to allow the teacher to be proactive.
Thank you. Can I follow up a little bit, just
Sure.
because this is, a very broad topic and one I think that we're all considering, and I know the college is right now developing an advisory to help teachers identify and support students in their mental health. But teachers aren't the only ones. And so as you're talking, and I'm thinking about a teacher being aware of that, can you talk a little bit about the community approach, the other partners, and sometimes who are more expert maybe in issues of mental health, who are supporting students, and what we can do to work together?
Definitely, and I think some of our school partners are doing a great job of tying in. Like, for example, if we're doing training or professional development with the school, it's not just the teachers. It's a lot of onus on the teacher. Instead, you have the local healthcare provider or psychologist or mental health group coming in and be able to tie into that work. You have even the parent liaisons coming in, just so they're driving awareness, communicating this to the overall parent community. And if you have a broader, counseling group or even your principal leadership, allows the overarching kind of message to be not only on the shoulders of a teacher, but on the overall community, to look for those indicators, to be able to proactively provide support, and also use that vocabulary. If you're talking about self-regulation, not everyone may have that, but all of a sudden, if everyone is speaking about these different, these different indicators and different kind of vocabulary, that becomes even that much easier for everyone to be proactive in the support.
Jeffrey, in one of your previous responses, you alluded to truth and reconciliation, a little bit of some of the fractious relationships that we have in society. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Indigenous education and the extent to which Indigenous ways and methods of knowing and being are or are not incorporated into the way that we teach students, not only students of Indigenous ancestry, but all of our students, and helping to share that culture. Any of your experiences in that regard?
Yeah, I think we're at a really interesting moment when I think that we've had a couple of years in Canada where there has been widespread increasing engagement in this issue around Indigenous education. I think the way this often gets taken up in classrooms is like an addendum to social studies education, or we figure out how to often awkwardly dance our way through territorial acknowledgements. And this kind of becomes the limit of what we imagine is possible in Indigenous education, and it leaves me unsatisfied. And I think it also leaves a lot of our students wanting more. I think we have to, right now, continue to sustain our commitment to engaging in this in deeper ways. And I say that because I think we're at a political moment where that's going to shift. And I guess what I would say is that there is no vibrant Canadian future without negotiating this history and this fractured relationship. And I think that's just something we have to be committed to. It will involve intentionally putting Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators alike in contexts where speaking to these issues will be disruptive, it will be challenging, it will be critically engaging, and at times precarious. But I also think that's where the possibility lies. And I think what I would say is I often look to children and their curiosity and their moral concern, their ethical concern about the relationship of Indigenous peoples in our country as a really good pulse and an indicator for how good or how not good we're doing as adults. And I think following following the curiosity and the heartfulness of kids has been a really grounding part of the work in Indigenous education for me. But yeah, I'll stop there.
I know you have a lot more to say, and I'm thoughtful about your comment about our limitations, or the limitations right now. And I know my own knowledge is limited. So can you talk a little bit about, is there a body of knowledge, or is there information that's available to all of us to help inform us so that we can get beyond our limitations and go forward to that brighter future that you're seeing, that we can't achieve without that, without those limitations being crossed or
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is that it's not inconsequential that knowledge somehow feels hidden from the majority of Canadians. And I think sometimes we just make that seem like something that is it's just the way things have turned out. But I guess my perspective would be that that's been structured in a particular way to accomplish that end. And so what I encourage all of my students to do, I assigned it as required reading this year in all my courses, is I require reading of at least one chapter of the TRC report. And it's amazing to me, every decade or so in Canada, we have a massive nationwide commission which produces thousands of pages of the lived experiences, narrated lived experiences of Indigenous people, yet most Canadians don't read it. And so I think that's a good place for us to start. But I also want to say that I don't think there's one vision of Indigenous education, nor is there one curriculum that's cohesive or that will solve every challenge or possibility. I think really what we need to be thinking more in terms of is not what is the right things to read or do, but what types of relationships can I meaningfully embed my life within? How can I engage more deeply to the communities on whose land I live and move within, and to start building a better sense of relationship. And I think that, for me, is where the learning naturally begins to happen, when we encounter one another's lives, our stories, both our joy and pain in that. And I think that, to me, is as equally important as going and picking up all of the brilliant Indigenous scholarship that's happening here at the University of Toronto, around Canada, reading Indigenous poets, listening to Indigenous music, listening to and engaging with the arts community here in Toronto. I mean, we live in one of the most vibrant Indigenous pop culture hubs in the world. And we can access that and learn from that and be challenged to grow from that. So that would be what I would encourage people to do. And come take my class. Yeah.
That was a shameless plug, but it was a good one. And I know that one of our goals, after we're done talking here, is to speak with all of you, and for us to have an opportunity to start building some of the relationships that you spoke about. And so I know I'll be following up with you to see how I can start to build that relationship and incorporate it into my my professional and personal life, which I think is really key. Yeah.
So I'm going to add a question in here. And so there's this notion that anxiety is on the rise for children and youth. And there's some data out there to support that. So I'd love to hear from the panelists as to what your thoughts are on the contributing factors, because there are so many. In my space, what we focus on is the fact that there are so many expectations that are put on youth as well as children to know exactly what they want to be when they grow up. And so this idea that I have to go on one path, and then as early as grade 8, identify the courses that are going to put me through one stream. That stream is going to lead to another, my next step, so on and so forth. And there's not really that flexibility to change once we've chosen that path at such an early age. And I think in my work, what we found is that does create anxiety for youth and children, and that's a contributing factor. But as we know, that's not the only factor. So I would love to hear the panel's thoughts on that. And Richard, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I guess I'm the person who represents people who work with the youngest children. And I would say that in early years education and elementary school, we do see, of course, children experiencing anxiety as well. So it's beginning there, and it does beg the question, what's happening there? So if the environment that one is creating is a competitive environment, that would be contributing to a sense of anxiety. If the notion of learning is that there is a right answer and your job is to guess what that right answer is, so that risk-taking is risky, then that creates anxiety as well. If children are if individuality is a hindrance rather than something that is celebrated, where the idea that children learn differently instead of, again, being celebrated as something that looks negative, then of course that creates anxiety. So we're trying to create, working with teachers, trying to create environments that are where children feel secure, psychologically secure, able to take risks, not hide behind any aspect of their identity, their learning preferences, and so that children can simply be and show us what they're curious about and what they're thinking right now, rather than trying to give the right answer. And then working with that, after we've created that environment and children are stating their ideas and theories and feelings, celebrating that and having children then, in a constructivist way, research those ideas and improve upon those ideas. Very different than a factory model where students know that there's a right answer and I'm going to be graded in a certain way and ranked in a certain way.
So powerful. Amy, what are your thoughts in terms of anxiety and what we see with youth and children?
So we work with school leaders in districts from all across North America that range from some of the most impoverished to some of the most wealthy. And across the board, anxiety is an issue. It's very different. So like to your point around, not knowing what they want to be or feeling the competitive pressures. At the higher end, we find that that's often the case, extreme pressure to get into that Ivy League school, to be able to be successful, and they put immense pressure. And in some of those cases, the risk of suicide is actually really high. On the other flip side, we have some of our school boards that are, very diverse, high refugee population, high, migrant population that doesn't speak necessarily the local language, and they're experiencing other types of stresses and trauma, and, they need to, again, learn how to cope. And across the board, we're finding, like I talked about this earlier, self-regulation skills, so be it mindfulness or learning how to be able to, be aware and be able to manage those becomes so crucial. And so it's becoming, I think more and more, and in early childhood it's kind of a bedrock, but it needs to be something that continues on, and not even as just students but as adults. And so often it comes down to also teachers. One of the first questions I'll ask during PD is like, how are you doing? And a lot of people will be like, I'm good. And it's like, are you really good? And often, you don't think about like all the stuff that came with you, the traffic, maybe you had an argument in the morning with your partner, and whatever it is, that comes with you. And if you're not aware of that, that can also reflect in how you're teaching. And so often, I think it's a community approach in many ways. It's not just the teacher, it's the principal, it's the leadership, it's the students. And I think the more and more we get better and more aware, I think that anxiety will get better to be able to manage that.
You bring up such a good point that it's youth and children, but it's also adults that are experiencing anxiety. And so whenever I do my training, I always ask my audience, are you experiencing stress? And across the board, everybody is experiencing stress. And to your point, it's various different types of stresses, right? It's not just defined in one way. And it's, well, how do we cope with that? How do we manage that? What strategies do we put into place? And one thing that we're finding that's so common is that people don't take time to recover. So when they engage in a stressful event, they're not taking time to recover from it, whether it's 10 minutes, whether it's 5 minutes, whether it's a day. And that recovery piece is so, so critical, especially for our mental health. Jeffrey, what are your thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts. So I guess I'm just going to be really frank with the communities that I work in are often northern, rural, remote, reserve communities, or they are communities of youth that are homeless in Canada's urban centers. And, when I ask them the things that stress them out, it's things like police violence, it's things like racism, it's things like housing inequity and lack of available or affordable housing, or the barriers that are in place to access jobs and meaningful employment. I think about, for all of us, what it means to live in a time when our planet is so rapidly changing, and its habitability is a question. I mean, I don't want to depress everyone, but I feel stressed by those things. And so for me, the question of education is often with the communities that I serve, what does it mean to promote livability, to nourish vitality and spirit in communities living in their dystopian present. And that's like a very like dark Jetsons, starting place. But I say that because I don't want to pretend like that's not the case for communities. Canada has, communities that for decades have not had clean running water. And yet we're surprised to find out that those are the communities that have the highest rates of suicide in the country. To me, it's not surprising. You look at communities in Northern Ontario and you ask youth from those communities that have experienced high rates of suicide, what would help your community feel better? And they say, dust control. I hear that and I go, that's simple. We can do that. We can address that issue, or clean water, or a swimming pool, or a hockey rink. To me, I think the ways that we make our lives more livable are often a lot simpler. It's about taking time to rest, being with one another, having a meal together. Those sorts of material practices, I think, are a really important part of how we have to think about what it means to live with vitality in a very stressful time, and to maybe promote, I think, on the material end, a closer relationship to the material world, even in the midst of a digital and kind of AI revolution, that we're still taking care of our relationships with the planet.
Yes.
That's my 2 cents for the moment.
Thank you.
Sorry about the dystopian present. That was really gnarly.
No, and that's so important to bring to the table too, because when we talk about the future of education, it's not to be fluffy about it or sugarcoat anything, right? We want to talk about the issues that we're facing now and how is that going to impact us in the future. So thank you for bringing that. Michael, what do you think?
Well, I was going to say earlier. Now I'm going to probably riff off of what you were saying, Jeffrey. But I think that one of our goals of education is to help young people develop themselves. They can be happy and productive citizens in our civil society. I think there's anxiety when they don't see what the pathway is to be happy for some of the reasons, maybe Jeffrey, that you outlined, or some of their own personal reasons, or what productive means when you don't know what your job will be or what your pathway is. I think, for people of my generation, it was easier because you could see a pathway and you could see people who were productive and happy in roles that you could aspire to, and you knew what pathways to pursue to do that. I think dwelling in a space of ambiguity now, or a tolerance for ambiguity is one of the ways maybe to reduce anxiety and understand that we may not know right away what that is, and there may be some obstacles in our path, but together we can overcome some of those. I think that's one of the sources for anxiety, is not necessarily seeing an easy pathway to be a happy and productive citizen.
Amazing. And so my last question to the entire panel is, how do we maximize teacher impact in the context of the future of education? So for teachers, how do we maximize their impact? Jeffrey, I'm going to start with you, and we'll go down the panel this way.
So I think first and foremost, we were introduced as a panel of experts, and I hate the term because I think that's really not what it means to me to be an educator. And I think about the role of a teacher and what that role needs to be today, I think is much more of a convener, a facilitator, and also somebody who can nourish the space that lends itself to vitality, who can hold and inspire creative learning. And I also think somebody, and in a sense, can inspire ethical relationships to the planet and the people around you. And to me, that's where I see, what it means to support and nourish education's future in terms of teacher education. I guess the other thing I would say is that I don't know a good teacher that has stopped learning. And who doesn't humbly kind of position their work as a work in process. And I think if we can really, I think we're in a season when professionalization is so strong, has such power in terms of, yes, often intended to bring greater accountability to the work, but at times also, I think can create a rigidness to what it means to be an educator or any other types of professionals. But I think what really inspires me in terms of the future of education and teacher training is to train the types of people that are creative enough and responsive enough to the world around them that they are able to actually hear and know how to engage some of the most complex and pressing issues of our time. And I think that requires a lot of heart and flexibility.
nourish a space that lends to vitality. That's so powerful in terms of roles of educators. Thank you, Richard.
I mentioned security for children, and I feel that the same applies to teachers, that teachers need to be given respect and given a sense of a sense that this is a safe space for them to ask the questions they need to ask, take the risks, make the relationships that need to be made in terms of responding to the Reconciliation Commission. And along with that, take sort of a developmental approach with teachers as well. Giving teachers, regardless of where they are on the path, opportunity to continue to grow, to continue to learn and innovate and define what it means to be a teacher and respond to the needs of the children today for the future. And then the third part, I would say, and in fact, these are the three aspects of the sort of the philosophy of the lab school: the security approach that came to us from Dr. Blotz, the developmental approach that came to us from our history in psychology, and then the third part comes to us as a lab school, an inquiry approach, and I think you've alluded to that as well. The sense that a teacher needs to know what I know what the questions are that I want to research, state, and my theories, and test out those theories, and see that this is an ongoing profession, one that continuously enforces us to be looking at the latest research, incorporating those findings in our teaching, but also knowing that our teaching informs the research. And so I think those three aspects are.
It's such a reciprocal process, right? That feeds into each other. Amy, what do you think in terms of maximizing teacher impact?
Yeah, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier around teacher wellness. And I do think as much as, there's a lot of emphasis around students learning, critical social emotional learning skills and being resilient and whatnot, I think that onus for teachers to be able to put that time and to take care of themselves will not only allow them to have those relationships with students that will allow them to be more proactive, allow them to be able to more personalize in their support, but also be able to facilitate a community of learning where a student does feel secure, that they feel empowered to learn. And I think that's really crucial to social emotional learning in terms of that theory. It's not only just creating that caring and cultivating a caring community, but also modeling and really living it. And so I think not only as children, but as as teachers and as a community, we also need to live that too.
I think it's so powerful, this idea that we want to embrace social and emotional learning and build that among our students, but then what about our teachers? And actually, Michael, you might not remember this, but 4 years ago, our first meeting, I asked you that question. I said, we are trying to foster social and emotional learning, but what about our teachers? And when we spoke about that, we also spoke at OISE, and we ended up creating a workshop series for, at that time, BEd, as well as Master of Education students, on developing emotional intelligence for teachers and for educators. So it was a 4-part series, and then if you attended it, there would be a note on the co-curricular record. It was amazing, and we had a packed house every single time, because this idea, it's so important to build this within our students, but we also need to build it within our teachers as well. Michael, how do we maximize teacher impact?
All the ways that were so well articulated here, but I think about teaching. I think about, we facilitate learning in the company of others, in the company of lots of others, not just our teaching colleagues, but the parents of the children, the parents and guardians, the communities are a bigger part of society, and we educate the whole child. So we look at their cognitive development, their social development, physical, spiritual, and we individually aren't experts in all of those areas. And continuing with that thought, we need to be able to feel okay to say, I can't do all of this. And so here's what I can do with this child, with this class, with this lesson, with this unit this year, and who can help me with some of the other components. And I think maximizing it is sometimes spreading our expertise into other areas and saying, I can do these things, and here's some of the things that I'm working on, who can help with this. And that may be reaching beyond the walls of the school. Certainly working with our school leaders and our colleagues, but the greater community, and I think bringing them into the facilitation of learning and seeing that they have a role in playing that as well. What do you think?
I was not anticipating that.
What does Surrey think?
That's such a good point. It's also that self-awareness of knowing when you can't do it all, right? And that's okay. We sometimes put these expectations on ourselves that we should be able to, but having that awareness and then that confidence to ask for help. Not that asking for help is going to make us look weak, but it's actually going to make us stronger because our outcome is would be stronger. How do we maximize teacher impact? You know, I work a lot with educators, especially in the space of emotional resilience, and I alluded to it earlier that everyone's stressed. Right? Everyone is stressed out. Educators, they're stressed out. Everyone is stressed out. And I think this idea of being able to manage stress, to become resilient, especially in this changing landscape, is going to be critical, especially for educators, in order to maximize the impact that they have. Because if you think about it, the most powerful relationship an educator has is with their students, right? And so if we don't take care of ourselves, that's going to trickle down into our classroom. There's a huge study that came out of Texas, and the study said this: when you interact with someone that you find rude, the next person that interacts with you is actually going to think that you are rude. And you actually might be the nicest person ever. And when I say that is you might have had an incident in the morning, you might have gotten your coffee, it didn't go so well. We bring those experiences to the classroom. Amy alluded to it earlier as well. Like whatever we go through, we bring that with us to the classroom. Our students feel that from us. Well, so how do we overcome that? It goes back to what I said earlier. We take time to recover. Right? We had an incident, put us in a negative emotional state. Well, we need to take 5 minutes, 10 minutes to recover from that so that the next person that interacts with us, whether it's a peer, a colleague, an administrator, or a student, they don't find us to be rude. Right? So that idea, I think for educators, we need to take care of ourselves so that we aren't stressed and that we are showing up at our best, because the impact it's going to have on students is tremendous. And so in terms of the questions that were asked today, we actually did something very different with this panel. None of us created the questions. All of the questions that were asked today were submitted by the audience. And so there was this option to submit questions because we wanted to go kind of outside of the box of the traditional, you know, we answer some questions we come up with in live Q&A. We wanted to ensure that the questions that were asked came from the audience. So thank you to all of you for submitting your questions. We integrated all of them into our panel talk today. And through the reception, which there is food, thank you, we will have the opportunity to connect with you if you do have any further questions. I want to reiterate that this is just the start of the conversation. Michael mentioned it earlier. When we were talking about co-moderating the panel, one thing that came up with feedback is there are a lot of voices missing from the table here. We don't claim to represent everyone. We've got 5 voices up here, but this is just the start of a larger conversation. And due to demand, we are actually thinking about doing another panel in February representing different voices and their perspectives and their ideas on the future of education. And so we welcome your thoughts, we welcome your suggestions, we welcome your questions, because the future of education belongs to all of us. So on behalf of both Michael and myself, thank you to all of you for participating, for showing up, and thank you to all the panelists for joining us today and sharing your thoughts and experiences.
Wow. Thank you for that thought-provoking discussion and panel. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce another talented education professional, Dr. Rhonda Martinussen, Director of Dr. Eric Jackman Institute of Child Study. Dr. Martinussen joined OISE after receiving her PhD from U of T's Institute of Medical Science. She has immense experience in teaching, supervising, administrative leadership, and research that make her an apt leader in the JICS community, and we are so thrilled to have her here. Please welcome Dr. Rhonda Martinussen.
Thank you very much. So first, I'd like to say that this was just an incredible discussion about the future of education, and it was so interesting to hear all the different perspectives and kind of the connections that were made. It's an opportunity for all of us to think deeply about the future of education, and I know that this is just, as Sim said, an initial start to the conversation, one that has to continue, I think, given the issues that we're facing as a society and within the education sphere. I'd like to thank our panelists for their contribution today to really come here, take the time to add your ideas to it. And it was enlightening and thought-provoking, as Sim said. And I'd also like to thank our organizing team for their hard work, because this was not an easy, I think, event to put together, and they did an amazing job. So really, thank you very much. And so I think we have some here. So I'd like to thank you so much.
Thank you.
So